600 years ago, a man-eating monster known as a Bulgasal emerged, plunging humanity into a nightmare. Though now relegated to folklore, one Bulgasal remains. To understand, we return to that time. A traveling party crossing a snow-covered mountain encountered this man-eating creature. When the mother approached, the monster fled. She then declared her unborn child cursed, unable to be born. The next morning, the husband found his wife gone, but their child had miraculously been born. Villagers discovered the grieving father, and an old woman revealed the child was cursed by a Bulgasal, destined to be hunted by it. 10 years passed. The child, now a young man, faced constant ostracism. After a hunter was killed by the monster, the villagers blamed the young man, accusing him of bringing the creature. That night, another family was slaughtered. Their enraged relatives hunted the young man, forcing him to flee to a frozen lake where he fell through the ice, consumed by despair. A woman rescued him, but while protecting him from the enraged villagers, she was fatally stabbed. Enraged, the young man fought back, but the villagers were too numerous. Then, General Hoyol intervened, condemning the villagers' cruelty towards a child. Despite hearing the old woman's account of the curse, the general, disbelieving in superstition, adopted the boy, naming him Dan Hwal. 17 years later, the aging Hoyol entrusted his legacy to Dan Hwal, who had become a powerful monster hunter, feared and respected as the Demon Slayer. While fighting a mind-controlling monster, the general's army turned on each other. Dan Hwal seized the opportunity, striking the monster with a spear, restoring the soldiers to their senses. The monster revealed its immense true form, and Dan Hwal, despite being thrown to the ground and bitten on the ear, fought and killed it. However, the soldiers still despised Dan Hwal for his lack of emotion at their deaths and his lowly origins, refusing to serve under him. Aware of their disdain, Dan Hwal remained aloof, except for his adoptive father, and showed no ambition for rank or power. He longed for a life free from the Bulgasal's curse in his next reincarnation. Hoyol, however, vowed to protect Dan Hwal in every life. Dan Hwal had yet to encounter a Bulgasal, as these creatures rarely leave survivors to tell the tale. Then, a messenger arrived, summoning Hoyol and Dan Hwal home. They found Dan Hwal's wife, Hoyol's daughter, distraught after the premature birth of their second child, which resulted in her death. She blamed Dan Hwal's curse. Heartbroken, Dan Hwal created a small grave for his daughter. His elder son, unable to see, sensed his sister's death. Dan Hwal blamed himself for his children's suffering. He couldn't bring himself to comfort his son and left. His wife, consumed by grief and anger, attempted to kill him. He disarmed her, barehanded, understanding her pain, sharing a similar experience of ostracism. He showed her his past, then vowed to hunt down the Bulgasal, taking his son with him, promising to protect him at all costs. Returning to the mountain, Dan Hwal found villagers binding a young boy, intending to sacrifice him to the Bulgasal. The old woman recognized him and warned that everyone there would die. Dan Hwal, fueled by hatred for both the villagers and the monster, declared he would kill the Bulgasal and behead anyone who interfered. As they ascended the mountain, villagers swarmed them, fearing the Bulgasal's wrath. During the ensuing battle, Dan Hwal spotted the woman who'd saved him years ago and pursued her. He discovered she was the Bulgasal, but shielded her from an arrow, repaying her kindness. Confused soldiers obeyed his order to retreat. That night, Dan Hwal overheard his son telling his mother that his father had never approached him, held his hand, or let him see his face, believing Dan Hwal hated him. Alone, Dan Hwal searched for the Bulgasal, only to find it attacking his camp. His wife and son escaped, but were pursued. Dan Hwal found his wife dead and his son dying, overwhelmed with regret for his coldness towards his son. The Bulgasal struck him, but Dan Hwal retaliated, killing the monster. However, he became the new Bulgasal. Soldiers, unable to kill him, retreated to inform Hoyol. Grief-stricken, the general ordered Dan Hwal's hunt. Dan Hwal sought out Hoyol on the mountain, begging him to kill him, attempting suicide in vain. He blamed himself for his family's deaths. Despite this, Hoyol refused, suggesting he find a solitary life away from humanity. Though a monster, Dan Hwal possessed a human heart. When soldiers arrived, Hoyol protected him, but they disobeyed and killed the general. Enraged, Dan H. Wall, in his monstrous form, slaughtered his former comrades, only stopped by Hoyol's last-ditch effort. Dan H. Wall took his dying father to seek medical care. Knowing his time was short, Hoyol made Dan H. Wall swear never to become a monster or drink human blood again. Hoyol, filled with regret for his treatment of his daughter, passed away. The old woman reappeared, explaining that a Bulgasal, lacking a soul, must kill its cursed victim to end its immortality and be reborn as a human. Dan H. Wall cursed the woman who caused his suffering, vowing revenge. Years passed. War erupted near Dan H. Wall's refuge. He defended innocent people, killing those who approached, sustaining himself solely on horse blood, honoring his promise to his father. For 3 years, he hunted the woman. A man, drawn to Dan H. Wall, invited him home to see a painting of the woman he had killed. Dan H. Wall recognized his enemy and the man as a past life monster he had slain, now seeking the Bulgasal's immortality. They fought, Dan H. Wall winning easily with his experience. Now, his only option is to wait for the woman's rebirth to exact his revenge. Time passes to the modern era. Dan H. Wall hires a private investigator, offering a gold bar to investigate 2 women depicted in a photograph. Days later, Dan H. Wall tracked down his younger sister. She recounted the events to her older sister, and they fled their home without telling their mother. The older sister, knowing the nature of the Bulgasal, recognized something unusual about their bus driver and, upon exiting, pulled her sister away. The driver pursued them. The older sister threatened him with a knife, but he brushed it off, targeting only the younger sister. She stabbed him in the neck, and they hid in a house. The older sister explained that the driver was a past life monster seeking revenge. She emphasized that no other monster could compare to the Bulgasal. Frightened, the younger sister tried to call their mother, but the older sister stopped her, causing the younger sister to believe her sister was insane. The older sister, bearing a scar from Dan H. Wall's attack and memories from her past life, sought refuge with an old acquaintance. The older sister asked her younger sister to stay, as she needed to find a sword to kill the Bulgasal and end the cycle. However, that night, the younger sister called their mother and ran away, despite the old woman's attempts to stop her. She reunited with her mother, and they returned home. The older sister discovered them on the stairs, arguing. The Bulgasal attacked, forcing the 3 to pack their belongings. The older sister hid her younger sister in a closet, only to have the monster kill their mother and her. The younger sister emerged, armed with a knife, but was knocked unconscious. Police arrived and took her to the hospital. The younger sister, Sang-un, refused to tell the investigating detective anything. That night, Dan H. Wall found Sang-un, but she escaped with her youngest sister to the old woman's house. 15 years later, Dan H. Wall investigated, only to learn the 3 had moved long ago. On their mother's and older sister's death anniversary, Sang-un returned to the old house. Overwhelmed by fear at the time, she'd forgotten her sister's instructions to kill the Bulgasal. Dan H. Wall arrived, attempting to open the door, but breaking the handle. He forced his way in, only to find Sang-un had escaped through a hole in the closet. He pursued her, encountering security guards. Sang-un reached home and contacted her younger sister, Si-ho, who ignored her to go out with her boyfriend, having always resented her older sister for attracting the Bulgasal, leading to their mother and older sister's deaths. Meanwhile, Dan H. Wall contacted numerous detectives he'd hired, but none could find Sang-un, despite his previous success. He cursed their incompetence. Sang-un sought information about the sword to kill the Bulgasal, contacting antique sword collectors. None of the swords felt right, none inspired the feeling of protection her sister had described. While waiting for a bus, she felt uneasy around a man in a green jacket. Her sister's warnings about her past life pursuers, that a feeling of unease meant an enemy was near, returned. She fled, pursued by the man, who turned out to be the bus driver. He revealed that many were hunting her and that even if she hid, he could still track her by the scent of her soul. Meanwhile, Dan H. Wall hunted down other demons to eliminate competition. He found one in a parking garage after an abduction, subduing him. This demon was one he'd killed before. Dan H. Wall wanted information about the 2 women in the photograph, knowing demons' skill and tracking by scent. The demon mentioned a disturbing smell, leading Dan H. Wall to Sang-un's bracelet, unlocking his own olfactory tracking abilities. The demon attempted a sneak attack, but Dan H. Wall dispatched him, ensuring his disappearance from police records. Dan H. Wall then gave the detective a lead saying Un might be working at a laundromat, offering 2 gold bars to halt the investigation into his own affairs. The detective contacted a colleague, who happened to be the officer who handled Sang Un's case. He wanted to know who hired the detective, but was rebuffed due to professional ethics. Knowing he wouldn't get information, he declined the job. He recalled Sang Un mentioning the Bulgasal and understood its nature. Dan H. Wall bought bandages to treat his wounds, his healing abilities weakening due to his avoidance of blood. As he closed his trunk, he discovered the demon's hidden accomplice, a young man. Terrified, the young man accidentally stabbed Dan H. Wall. Dan H. Wall refused medical attention. Using the addresses the detective provided, he found Sang Un's workplace, but she was using an alias. The manager stated she'd left, although she was actually still there, concealed in clothing. They unknowingly passed each other. Dan H. Wall, however, had Sang Un's address and gave it to the detective for verification. At work, Sang Un dropped something and was aided by a man, whom she thanked with a bottle of water. Dan H. Wall, returning to his car, learned from the detective that the address was a vacant lot. Disbelieving, he went to check himself and remembered the woman's bracelet, identical to his, and rushed back. The driver had arrived and pursued Sang Un. Unconsciously, she fought back, but as he prepared to retaliate, Dan H. Wall intervened, deflecting the attack and subduing the driver. Uncertain how to handle Sang Un, he was surprised by the arrival of her sister, Si-ho, who was the reincarnation of his wife. Both sisters found Dan H. Wall unsettling and dangerous, quickly deciding to move. Si-ho, however, was unwilling to continue her life, pregnant and abandoned by her cheating boyfriend who refused to support her. Meanwhile, Dan H. Wall attempted a self-destructive car crash, but survived and was rescued by an elderly woman driving a truck who'd nearly hit him. She cut his license plate off and gave him a ride. She was the same old woman who'd once scorned him, but her opinion had changed since he became a Bulgasal. Though reincarnated, she recognized him. He revealed that he'd found Sang Un, but his wife was her sister, their destinies intertwined. He took her home. She regularly delivered food to him since he'd long since grown disgusted with animal blood. He'd saved her life 50 years ago, and this was her repayment. He'd hesitated before, letting Sang Un escape. This time, he stated he'd kill the driver before he could take his prey and asked the old woman to help watch over Sang Un once he transformed her into a Bulgasal. After the old woman left, Dan H. Wall discovered a break-in. The intruder was the young man he'd previously locked in his car trunk. Dan H. Wall wanted him to leave, but the young man pleaded for protection from the murderer. Dan H. Wall, without revealing the murderer's death, tried to dismiss him. The young man refused, threatening to expose Dan H. Wall online. Dan H. Wall was forced to tie him up and lock him in a room. Meanwhile, the detective from years ago visited the detective with a receding hairline, seeking a partnership to gather information on Dan H. Wall. He only obtained Dan H. Wall's phone number. When he called, the young man answered, revealing Dan H. Wall's address. The detective went to rescue the young man and confirmed that the house belonged to the murderer of Sang Un's mother and sister. Simultaneously, Dan H. Wall rescued Si-ho from the driver. He pursued the driver, inadvertently being seen by the detective and the young man. He beat the driver severely, learning he had an accomplice known as Black Hole. However, the detective intervened. Dan H. Wall was shocked to recognize him as his foster father, Ho-yol, from years past, and fled. Dan H. Wall then contacted the other detective, who revealed Sang Un was in a nursing home, with no suspicious individuals following her. As he spoke, the detective was murdered by Black Hole. Visiting her grandmother, Sang Un found the elderly woman unable to recognize her, lamenting about a past life. Sang Un left, but her grandmother revealed that killing a Bulgasal requires another Bulgasal. Si-ho's call informed Sang Un that Dan H. Wall wasn't human and had just stormed into their home. While returning, Black Hole, disguised as an insurance agent, offered Sang Un a ride. She fled, pursued by Black Hole. She jumped into his car, only to be caught. Dan H. Wall arrived, ramming his vehicle into Black Hole's, sending it into the woods, and then chased after Sang Un. He found her in a tunnel. Sang Un, wielding a sword from Black Hole's car, stabbed Dan H. Wall, demanding to know why he killed her family. Dan H. Wall insisted he didn't kill innocent people. explaining his past confusion between the twin sisters and how he only found Sang-un alive after hearing a scream. Meanwhile, Ho-yeol and the two others were approaching when the driver strangled Ho-yeol, causing a car accident. When Ho-yeol awoke, Black Hole had drained the driver of his blood. Dan H-wall realized another Bulgasal existed, Black Hole, who soon attacked. Dan H-wall sent Sang-un to escape while he fought Black Hole. Black Hole, an older Bulgasal, proved stronger, impaling Dan H-wall before pursuing Sang-un. He captured her, intending to kill her. Sang-un remembered her sister's advice, find the man with a scar on his hand. She recognized Dan H-wall's scar. The young man awakened Dan H-wall, who drew his sword. As Black Hole moved to kill Sang-un, the scar on his chest reacted, prompting him to try to strangle Sang-un quickly. Dan H-wall arrived, striking Black Hole, who fled. Sang-un pleaded with Dan H-wall to help destroy the Bulgasal, as her sister had instructed, and he agreed, tired of the cycle of death and loss. Si-ho brought Sang-un home. As they approached the car, the young man arrived, wanting a ride, feeling they were all in this together. Dan H-wall also encountered Ho-yeol, unconscious by the roadside. He called for an ambulance and then went home. At home, Dan H-wall felt a strong urge to strangle Sang-un but lacked the courage. Sang-un dreamt of the day Black Hole tried to impale her, but his chest wound reopened, preventing him from acting. This wound was clearly inflicted by her older sister in a past life. Sang-un awoke, believing Dan H-wall was there to protect her. After questioning her, he realized she remembered nothing, so he locked her up and sent the old woman to fetch Si-ho. Sang-un, having a fiery temper, remained unconvinced until the old woman revealed several details of the situation. However, someone was following them. After taking Si-ho to the butcher shop, the old woman left Sang-un there and called Dan H-wall. She believed it was safe, surrounded by butchers. Dan H-wall arrived to find the young man had ransacked his house. He threatened to throw him out, but relented after the young man pleaded, giving him errands to buy food and bandages. Ho-yeol went to the police station to report the case, but as a former officer, his unsubstantiated report was dismissed. He privately spoke to a former colleague about Sang-un's case, but his mention of a monster biting necks was met with disbelief due to a similar incident that led to his dismissal. Ho-yeol vowed to find evidence to force the police to investigate. Dan H-wall brought Sang-un food. She claimed she needed to use the restroom. She turned on the water, locked the door, and used a piece of metal from the room to try to pry open the window. Dan H-wall stopped her, urging her not to waste her effort. He resented Sang-un's naivete, or her feigned naivete, suspecting manipulation. Sang-un realized he disliked her, though she didn't know why. Dan H-wall returned to the main question of whether she knew how to kill Black Hole, but her answer remained no. Black Hole called Dan H-wall, wanting a meeting. Dan H-wall left, entrusting the young man with Sang-un's care. Dan H-wall met Black Hole at a restaurant. Black Hole repeatedly circled around Dan H-wall's not being pure-blooded and his remaining human side, due to his reluctance to drink blood. Dan H-wall pressed for the main point. Black Hole admitted he didn't want to fight, but to help destroy Sang-un's soul. He offered to reveal the reason Sang-un cursed Dan H-wall in a past life in exchange for his assistance. Dan H-wall also wanted to know why Black Hole relentlessly hunted Sang-un, despite their past kinship. Black Hole showed him the curse Sang-un had placed on him in a previous life, a hole that couldn't heal for 1,000 years. He needed to destroy her soul 8 times to prevent reincarnation. This was the final attempt. He couldn't do it himself because of the curse and needed Dan H-wall's help. Dan H-wall, wanting to reclaim Sang-un's soul to end his immortality, refused. Black Hole threatened to repeatedly kill Sang-un in this life or the next, claiming he could wait, but Dan H-wall suffered daily due to not drinking blood. As Dan H-wall left, Black Hole stabbed him in the hand with a fork, clarifying it wasn't a negotiation but a threat, emphasizing their unequal status. He gave Dan H-wall his business card, Yul-T, suggesting he reconsider. Meanwhile, the young man guarding Sang-un heard her repeatedly banging on the door. Ho-yeol arrived, realizing the young man was hiding something and broke in to free Sang-un. She thought he was mistaken, but Ho-yeol wanted to know why she disappeared 15 years ago. When Sang-un expressed distrust in the police, Dan H-wall returned. Ho-yeol attacked Dan H-wall. But Dan H. Wall didn't intend to harm his father-in-law/foster father, subduing him and pleading for him to stop interfering. To avoid further conflict, Sang-un begged Ho-yeol to relent. Dan H. Wall then took her away. Sang-un, despite being warned not to trust Dan H. Wall, chose to believe him because he provided safety for her and her sister. He was the only one she trusted. However, Dan H. Wall remained doubtful of her trust. Si-ho repeatedly called her sister without success and saw Dan H. Wall's picture, using the opportunity of the woman and her employee being distracted to escape. Returning to Dan H. Wall, he refused to hand Sang-un over to Yul-T, who revealed that eliminating Sang-un's soul would benefit Dan H. Wall as well, achieving a complete Bulgasal form without needing to drink blood. Dan H. Wall scoffed, declaring he didn't need it, and threatened to throw Sang-un down a well. Yul-T, furious, vowed to hunt Dan H. Wall in every life, but Dan H. Wall remained unconcerned and hung up. Sang-un arrived, unaware of the well's purpose. Dan H. Wall explained, revealing her past life. Sang-un couldn't accept this. She had no memory and was almost thrown into the well. She was nearly killed when the old woman arrived, reporting Si-ho missing. Yul-T's accomplice answered the phone, forcing Sang-un and Dan H. Wall to search. Ho-yeol intercepted them. Sang-un left alone, no longer trusting Dan H. Wall after his attempted murder. Ho-yeol wanted to fight Dan H. Wall but prioritized Si-ho's situation. They found Sang-un swimming in a lake, searching for her sister. Dan H. Wall pulled her to shore. They couldn't find Si-ho. Yul-T called, giving Dan H. Wall one day to deliver Sang-un or his beloved would be killed. Enraged, Dan H. Wall decided to spare Sang-un, striking a deal. She would help him eliminate Yul-T in exchange for her life as a human. They discovered the caller's location and pursued him, but he escaped. Back at the car, Dan H. Wall asked Ho-yeol to check police records for recent drownings, noting any common factors. Though reluctant, Ho-yeol went to the station, bribing his former subordinate with instant ramen. He discovered a pattern in the recent drownings. Dan H. Wall and Sang-un returned to the lake to watch for the creature. However, Ho-yeol called them back, having found the creature's hiding place after a murder. The young man tried to eavesdrop, only to be chased away. Dan H. Wall felt certain he had killed the creature in a past life. The three arrived at a locked storage facility, bursting in. Sang-un sensed the creature inside. Dan H. Wall drove it to a swimming pool. It dove underwater, using its aquatic advantage. Ho-yeol pursued, his hand touched, causing him to scream, as the creature had taken his arm in a past life. Dan H. Wall pulled it out, but, focusing on calming his foster father, let it escape. Sang-un found Si-ho, but the creature was behind her. She used the knife Dan H. Wall had given her, fought back, and fled with Si-ho. She put Si-ho in an elevator and ran, but the creature pulled her into the lake. Dan H. Wall rescued her, aided by Si-ho, who pulled them both up. Knowing Dan H. Wall was a Bulgasal, Si-ho urged her sister to leave. Underwater, Dan H. Wall killed the creature, but lacked the strength to surface. Sang-un rescued him. She told Ho-yeol she and Si-ho would flee before the police arrived. The sisters took Dan H. Wall home. The young man helped get Dan H. Wall to his room, and then left, allowing Sang-un to perform CPR. She saved him. He chased her out because his leg was broken, and he wanted to reset it himself. The sisters reconciled. Dan H. Wall awoke and went to the kitchen for blood. Sang-un fetched it for him, asking his name. He refused, only mentioning Yul-T's name. Ho-yeol was being questioned as the sole witness to the creature's death. However, his superior called, classifying it as a suicide and closing the case. Yul-T, the police chief, was covering for Dan H. Wall, trying to recruit him at any cost. The next morning, the sisters searched Dan H. Wall's house for food, only to be discovered. Seeing their hunger, he sent the old woman with food, including meat and cooking supplies. The old woman wanted to speak to Dan H. Wall privately, questioning whether he was comfortable having his wife and her past life killer living together. He found it acceptable, so she didn't object. Later, Ho-yeol arrived, wanting to join the case due to a past feud with a Bulgasal. He wanted Dan H. Wall's identity, being the first in the group to learn it. The old woman argued, reminding Ho-yeol he was no longer a detective. Ho-yeol went outside and spoke to the sisters. Sang-un asked him to take Si-ho for a checkup due to a head injury. Sang Un then told Dan Hwal she wanted to go home to collect belongings, but he refused, believing Yul T might be waiting. Yul T was indeed there and had discovered Sang Un's plan. Ho Yol and Si Ho went to the hospital. The young man and the old woman went shopping. Sang Un entered Dan Hwal's room and saw pictures of her from her past life. She revealed her injury from the creature's grasp. Dan Hwal tended to it, causing her discomfort. She said that if she was responsible for the deaths of Dan Hwal's family, after defeating Yul T, she would return their souls and confine herself to the well. He disliked this, asserting she had no right to choose, but she wanted proof. Dan Hwal mentioned stabbing her in the shoulder in a past life, implying a scar should remain, but Sang Un stated only her sister had such a scar. Dan Hwal checked and was shocked to find he no longer knew who she truly was. They went to find answers. The young man and the old woman returned to find them gone. Ho Yol took Si Ho to the hospital and discovered she was pregnant and the father was a scoundrel. A paternal instinct from a past life urged him to help Si Ho. Sang Un arrived as Si Ho called. Noticing Dan Hwal showed more concern for his sister than for her. She questioned this, but Dan Hwal remained silent. They found Sang Un's house from 50 years ago, her previous life. Dan Hwal revealed Sang Un had lived reclusively, fearing Bulgasals, leading villagers to believe she was mad. Her parents tried to help but failed. One day, the house burned down, villagers believing Sang Un started the fire and escaped to the woods. Only her sister survived. That sister was the old woman who adopted them. Dan Hwal took Sang Un to the woods where Yul T had chased and killed her. But she had no memories. He wouldn't let her leave until she recalled something. He knew the details of the incident 50 years ago, explaining he'd been a step behind Yul T and missed the opportunity. Meanwhile, Ho Yol visited his detective friend to gather information on Yul T, but found nothing. He then sought out his former subordinate, who also had no information. However, he noticed the mayor and questioned why he was frequently at the police station. The subordinate warned Ho Yol against pursuing him, as the mayor was dangerous. Ho Yol followed him to a large house. His friend's investigation revealed that Yul T owned the property. That night, Dan Hwal and Sang Un stayed at a motel. Sang Un gave her blanket to Dan Hwal. When he woke up, he found her having a nightmare and felt a strange satisfaction at her suffering. The next morning, Dan Hwal announced they would search for people who knew about the old fire. Meanwhile, back at the house, everyone refused to clean, forcing the old woman to scold them. Si Ho went out to visit the old woman and ask about her past, hoping to read it. However, the old woman hid it, revealing a burn scar on her foot. Back with Dan Hwal, he and Sang Un used the old woman's name and successfully discovered the village fires were caused by a fire demon Dan Hwal had exorcised years ago. Sang Un went ahead while Dan Hwal reminisced about finding the old woman as a child and rescuing her, after which she prophesied future events, leading him to take her in. Si Ho, curious about the old woman's past, touched her hand and saw her past, experiencing a nosebleed from the shock. The old woman then made Si Ho tea, becoming startled by a glimpse of fire. Another young man appeared, announcing his departure. Dan Hwal and Sang Un continued their search, visiting a shaman whose son witnessed the fire. The son refused to answer, and Sang Un sensed he wasn't the fire demon, yet reacted negatively to the house's proximity. They entered, finding the true fire demon. Dan Hwal spoke with her, learning she was the arsonist, imprisoned by her son using the sound of drums. Years ago, she was tricked by Yul T but grew fond of fire, escalating her arson until she desired a final act, either setting a final place ablaze or killing Sang Un. Because Sang Un was present, the son resumed his confinement. Dan Hwal went to find her, while Sang Un was held captive. Dan Hwal arrived just as the son was about to set a fire, stopping him. Sang Un, guarding outside, overheard the fire demon reveal Yul T's weakness Sang Un herself, as Yul T was injured when he stabbed her in a past life. Meanwhile, Yul T met with his informant, the young man, who was spying on Dan Hwal. The young man obeyed only to help his brother's treatment and harbored no ill will. He urged Yul T to not kidnap Si Ho, finding her pitiable, and revealed Dan Hwal and Sang Un were investigating the fire. Yul T realized they were hunting the fire demon. Sang Un leaned closer to hear better and was choked by the fire demon, who revealed Yul T's weakness. When he stabbed her, He was also injured. Yul Ti reacted violently. Dan Hwal arrived, rescuing both Sang-un and Yul Ti from being strangled. He heard the fire demon's final words before her death, though they were meaningless. He then took Sang-un to the mountain, knowing her past life's remains were buried there. He confirmed this, leaving Sang-un unwilling to believe she abandoned everyone to die in the fire, refusing to accept being a cold-blooded monster. They sheltered from the rain, shared instant ramen, and returned home. Sang-un knew she couldn't atone for past lives' mistakes with just an apology, but she still offered one. Upon their return, the house was renovated. Dan Hwal questioned the old woman, who suddenly prophesied, "When memories are recovered, everyone present will die," before falling unconscious. Dan Hwal pulled the old woman back to her room to question her, just as Ho-Yol arrived, bringing food for Si-ho and wanting to speak privately with the two protagonists. He revealed he'd preliminarily investigated Yul Ti, but Dan Hwal urged him not to act alone. Ignoring Dan Hwal, he was persuaded by Sang-un to hold back. After Ho-Yol left, Dan Hwal followed him, wanting to know why he was also hunting Bulgasal. They went to a bar, drinking and talking. Ho-Yol wanted to know more about Dan Hwal's past, and he briefly recounted his childhood. Ho-Yol then revealed that 15 years prior, in the case of the two sisters, Yul Ti had someone take the fall and commit suicide, closing the case. However, Ho-Yol investigated further due to suspicions, and his assistant paid the price. She was dismissed, and he lost his job. He didn't believe his assistant committed suicide as reported, questioning why a mother would kill herself 3 days before her son's birthday. Dan Hwal looked at a photo of the assistant's family and noticed something unusual. He continued drinking while the two sisters discussed the old woman and then went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Sang-un woke up and went outside, only to be stopped by Dan Hwal. She worried about the old woman's prophecy, but Dan Hwal wanted her to stay inside for a while. The next morning, he followed the husband of the assistant, recognizing him as his callous father from a past life. Like before, after his wife's death, he spiraled into alcohol and neglect, this time blaming his child. Dan Hwal unleashed his childhood resentment on him before leaving. Back home, Sang-un wanted to know more, but he refused, saying he had no obligation to tell her anything. He mentioned several incidents overheard by Si-ho, forcing Sang-un to tell her sister the truth. Si-ho was disbelieving, so Sang-un asked her to hide her secret outings from Dan Hwal. The next morning, Yul Ti was fully recovered from being choked. He set out to find Dan Hwal, only to be followed by Ho-Yol, who set a trap for him. Yul Ti knew he was being followed. Meanwhile, Sang-un visited the old woman and learned a shocking truth. In her past life, Sang-un warned the village about the approaching Bulgasal before the fire. She also revealed that Yul Ti was responsible for Dan Hwal's family's death and blamed Sang-un. Meanwhile, Yul Ti informed Ho-Yol that he hadn't killed the assistant. Ho-Yol also inquired about his father's death years ago, but Yul Ti denied involvement, claiming he didn't kill without reason. He further revealed that there was another Bulgasal near Ho-Yol, a fact Ho-Yol was only just learning. Yul Ti then asked Ho-Yol to relay a message to Dan Hwal. He wouldn't wait any longer. As Ho-Yol was leaving, Yul Ti's assistant intentionally crashed into his car, knocking him unconscious, despite Yul Ti's prior instructions to let him go. Sang-un, having just left, received a call from the assistant. Dan Hwal, coming downstairs, found Sang-un gone. Si-ho lied, saying Sang-un was sick and resting, but then delivered the grim news about Ho-Yol's kidnapping. She explained that the kidnapper was a demon from a past life who wanted Dan Hwal, not her. Dan Hwal found Ho-Yol hanging from a tree, near death. Yul Ti, informed by the young man about the kidnapping, arrived as Dan Hwal was attempting to rescue his adoptive father. The demon, a large, imposing figure from the past, appeared, seeking revenge on Dan Hwal. She injected him with a potent poison, intending to torment him worse than death. Despite the poison, Dan Hwal struggled to free Ho-Yol. Enraged, the demon slashed his throat, causing him to collapse from the pain. Ho-Yol stepped in to protect him, and the demon threatened to kill them both. Before she could act, Yul Ti returned and bit her neck. Ho-Yol started to call for an ambulance, but Yul Ti revealed he was also a Bulgasal, demonstrating his rapid healing. Ho-Yol fled, leaving Yul Ti to shamelessly flatter Dan Hwal, trying to sway him to his side. Dan H-Wall remained distrustful, but Yul T insisted he wouldn't harm anyone connected to Dan H-Wall. At that moment, Sang-un arrived, and the three met for the first time. Sang-un revealed to Dan H-Wall that Yul T, not her, was the one who had murdered his family. Yul T feigned innocence, accusing Sang-un of lying and attempting to kill her, claiming that even if they both suffered, she would die first. Dan H-Wall injected Yul T with a dose of poison, forcing him to release Sang-un. Unwilling to act without knowing the full truth, he spared Yul T for the time being and was helped away by Sang-un and Ho-Yol. A flashback to 1,000 years prior revealed Yul T's past. His father, a high-ranking official, intended to pass on his position to Yul T's younger brother. Consumed by jealousy, Yul T murdered his brother and blamed a Bulgasal. The origin of his powers remained a mystery until his encounter with the first incarnation of Sang-un. Back in the present, Ho-Yol brought Dan H-Wall and Sang-un back to Dan H-Wall's home. Dan H-Wall was still recovering from his neck wound. Upon waking, he learned why Sang-un believed Yul T was his family's killer and decided to seek out the old woman. Seeing his suffering, Sang-un offered him her blood, but Dan H-Wall remained resolute in keeping his promise. Ho-Yol, at his friend's office, recalled his past. He had a younger sister, and their father was a criminal. Fearing for their safety, he fled with his sister, and their father was killed by a Bulgasal. The Bulgasal's presence weakened humans, and his already frail sister didn't survive. Dan H-Wall visited Ho-Yol, claiming he hadn't meant to keep secrets, but Ho-Yol, unconcerned, sent him away. Dan H-Wall and Sang-un set out to meet the old woman the next morning. Meanwhile, the young man was summoned by Yul T, who wanted him to bring Sang-un to him. Yul T, though hesitant, felt compelled to comply to ensure his brother's survival. Sang-un met with the old woman and tried to coax information about the past, but her carelessness caused the woman distress, forcing them to leave. Sang-un mentioned Si-Ho's ability to see past lives, suggesting they find someone present during the murder of Dan H-Wall's family. He called Si-Ho, who tried to use her ability but failed. Suddenly, Si-Ho experienced morning sickness, which the old woman noticed and excitedly announced. Dan H-Wall overheard, and that night, he pondered the possibility of his son being reincarnated, hoping for a happy life for him and Si-Ho. She also hoped for Dan H-Wall's happiness, to ease his melancholic life. Speaking of melancholy, a young man burdened with worries sought Dan H-Wall's advice. The young man explained that his older brother was seriously ill, but someone had offered to fund the treatment. Now, this benefactor demanded something in return that the young man was unwilling to do. Refusing the benefactor felt difficult. Dan H-Wall argued that someone who makes you suffer more isn't worthy of being called a benefactor, so if he didn't want to do it, he shouldn't. His brother's illness wasn't his fault. Upon returning, Dan H-Wall asked a detective to investigate the benefactor. Later, the household celebrated Si-Ho's birthday. The young man called Yul T to refuse his demand, but Yul T reminded him of their first encounter, how the young man had pleaded for his help, and now the tables were turned. Cornered, the young man agreed to meet Sang-un outside. Dan H-Wall met with the detective, and Ho-Yol revealed the true identity of the benefactor. Meanwhile, Sang-un asked the young man about their intended destination. He confessed everything, telling her to leave if she wanted. However, Sang-un understood that her presence put everyone at risk and decided to leave. The young man stopped her. Dan H-Wall arrived and wanted to speak to the young man privately. He finally understood why the young man had been persistently following him without fear. The young man tried to explain, but Dan H-Wall, no longer interested, sent him away. Dan H-Wall left with Sang-un, prompting the young man to call Yul T to ask about his brother's hospital. He learned his brother had died from his illness some time ago and that he had been deceived. Yul T then instructed his subordinate to bar the young man from the house and to find his secretary quickly. Dan H-Wall immediately packed to move as soon as possible to avoid Yul T. Si-Ho, overhearing this, called the young man and learned of his predicament. She rushed to tell Dan H-Wall that the young man had infiltrated their lives because, since childhood, he had been blind and Yul T had provided him with a corneal transplant, forcing him into servitude. Dan H-Wall realized with shock that the young man was the reincarnation of the son he had neglected in the past. He had two sons then, one blind and one deceased, just like the young man Du Yun and his brother. Du Yun then encountered the secretary and was lured into her car. Dan H-Wall frantically called Du Yun, but he didn't answer. Dan H-Wall decided to search for him and called Ho Yol for the address. Ho Yol urged him to bring Du Yun back and set him straight. While in pursuit, Yul T called. Knowing Yul T had gone to his house, Dan H-Wall rushed back. Yul T arrived, confronted Si-Ho, and demanded to know Sang-Un's whereabouts. Si-Ho claimed she had left with Dan H-Wall, which Yul T doubted, searching the house. Out of respect for Dan H-Wall, he left Si-Ho alone. He searched Dan H-Wall's room while Sang-Un hid in a closet behind a painting. Her fear of enclosed spaces forced her to remain calm. Just as Yul T was about to discover her, Dan H-Wall returned and invited him outside to talk. While driving, annoyed by Yul T's rambling, Dan H-Wall crashed the car into a shipping container, throwing Yul T from the vehicle. He demanded to know if Yul T had used Du Yun to spy on him because he knew Du Yun was his reincarnated son. Yul T, having suspected it all along and now confirmed, claimed he was helping father and son reunite. But Dan H-Wall wanted to know Du Yun's location. Suddenly, the secretary called, threatening to harm Du Yun as revenge against Dan H-Wall. Concerned, Yul T gave Dan H-Wall a lead while calling for his own rescue. Dan H-Wall returned home, instructing the women to prepare to move while he searched for Du Yun. Sang-Un insisted on leaving alone, then accompanied Dan H-Wall. Sensing that Du Yun was in trouble, Dan H-Wall confessed everything, and Ho Yol began investigating the case Yul T mentioned. Ho Yol revealed that the secretary had a traumatic childhood, her parents bludgeoned to death with no evidence found. 3 years prior, her in-laws were also murdered, with suspicion falling on her, but her husband protected her. After some consideration, they decided to go to the forest where Dan H-Wall had encountered her 600 years ago. She was trying to persuade Du Yun to join her side, as they both hated Yul T. Sang-Un now understood why Dan H-Wall was so strange. Yul T then called and shared his findings, saying he would search the workplace of the secretary's husband. Since he was a veterinarian, she would likely go there to treat her neck wound. Yul T also decided to lay low and leave Sang-Un alone for the time being. Passing by Ho Yol, Yul T asked him for a favor, assuring him he wouldn't harm him. Ho Yol accused Yul T of using Du Yun and now trying to save him. Yul T expressed regret for not being able to save Ho Yol's younger brother, clarifying that he hadn't used Du Yun, only asked for his help. He admitted he didn't understand why he cared about Du Yun but valued him as his only friend. Dan H-Wall arrived at the forest while Ho Yol and Yul T reached the secretary's husband's workplace. Dan H-Wall and Sang-Un searched the forest. Suddenly, Sang-Un's hand trembled. She sensed a monster nearby. Dan H-Wall pursued the feeling and found her. She had drugged and hidden Du Yun. Arrows flew, and Dan H-Wall realized her husband was also a reincarnated monster. The husband chased Sang-Un while Dan H-Wall fought and subdued the secretary. Knowing he had hidden Du Yun, Sang-Un made a deal. She would let him hunt her in exchange for Du Yun's location. He revealed Du Yun was at his parents' house and demanded she stand still so he could shoot her in the head. As he fired, Dan H-Wall intercepted the arrow. He pursued and killed the husband. They then went to find Du Yun. The secretary, meanwhile, had fallen into a ravine. She managed to get back to her car, where Yul T was waiting. Knowing she wouldn't survive, she had previously told Du Yun a secret that Yul T and Dan H-Wall had kept hidden. She relished the thought of the ensuing drama. Enraged, Yul T killed her. Du Yun woke up and called Dan H-Wall for help. But Yul T arrived first. Du Yun learned that Yul T had killed his wife and child 600 years ago. To prevent further trouble, despite his fondness for Du Yun, Yul T stabbed him, wanting to stop him from revealing this secret to Dan H-Wall. Ho Yol arrived to find Du Yun bleeding and unconscious. Dan H-Wall arrived shortly after, devastated at again failing to save his son. Paramedics arrived soon after, and they hoped Du Yun would survive. The next morning, they received the good news that Du Yun had lived. They didn't know the attacker, but Ho Yol believed they would find out when Du Yun woke up. Si-Ho called, and Dan H-Wall decided to keep Du Yun's situation from her. Si-Ho and the old woman were relieved Du Yun was alive. Days passed, but Du Yun remained unconscious. Dan H-Wall stayed by his side. Sang-Un told Ho Yol about the relationship between Du Yun and Dan H-Wall. shifting his perspective on Dan H-Wall. Dan H-Wall feared losing Du Yun as he had 600 years ago. Just then, Du Yun awoke. Sang-un went to get help, and Du Yun revealed to Dan H-Wall that Yul-Ti was the one who killed his family centuries ago. Dan H-Wall informed Sang-un and decided to confirm this. Yul-Ti, hearing that Du Yun was alive, knew Dan H-Wall would find out and waited for him. Du Yun was released from the hospital, and the old woman and Si-Ho were furious that his injury had been kept secret. After that, Dan H-Wall treated Du Yun well, readily fulfilling the boy's every wish. Du Yun, wanting to test Dan H-Wall's willingness, only asked for a camping trip or, alternatively, the elimination of Yul-Ti. That night, Dan H-Wall burned all the photos of Sang-un from his past lives, as he no longer had any reason to pursue her. He wanted her to give up the hunt and let him face Yul-Ti alone, suggesting she take Du Yun with her. Sang-un, however, considered Yul-Ti her enemy as well and offered herself as bait if necessary, willing to risk anything as long as Si-Ho was safe. Unable to sleep, Si-Ho went downstairs and found Du Yun crying. Overwhelmed with guilt for his deception and contemplating his own death, Du Yun was comforted by Si-Ho. The next morning, the family relocated to escape Yul-Ti, moving to a beautiful new house Dan H-Wall had purchased some time ago. They liked it so much they decided to stay. The shaman immediately began cleaning while Dan H-Wall and Sang-un went grocery shopping. Upon their return, they found the whole group fishing by the lake. Dan H-Wall suggested they return home before Yul-Ti discovered their absence, but Sang-un and Dan H-Wall, wanting to spend more time with their loved ones, stayed the night. They ate, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. When Ho-Yul offered Du Yun beer, Dan H-Wall refused, citing Du Yun's underage status. Ho-Yul, realizing he'd overstepped, tried to smooth things over. Later, Dan H-Wall and Ho-Yul spoke privately. Ho-Yul, childless himself, admitted he didn't fully understand Dan H-Wall's feelings, but expressed confidence in Dan H-Wall's ability to be a good father, asking him to protect Si-Ho and care for Du Yun. The tone, sounding like a farewell, was quickly brushed aside as they continued their convivial evening. As Dan H-Wall tucked Du Yun into bed, the boy pleaded with them to abandon their plan to eliminate Yul-Ti and live happily ever after. Si-Ho voiced a similar sentiment to her sister, noting her sister's apparent admiration for Dan H-Wall and surmising she had feelings for him. Her sister, however, denied this, claiming her praise was merely polite. Later, the two protagonists discussed their next steps. Dan H-Wall revealed he had a plan and just needed to execute it flawlessly. Dan H-Wall and Sang-un went to the warehouse to retrieve some items, but Dan H-Wall locked Sang-un inside and went alone. He then called Yul-Ti to arrange a meeting. The following morning, Si-Ho released Sang-un but refused to let her go alone, tired of being a bystander. Si-Ho decided to revisit Sang-un's past lives to find a way to help Dan H-Wall. Dan H-Wall had arranged to meet Yul-Ti at the well. After some tense conversation, Yul-Ti demanded to know Dan H-Wall's plan to send him down the well. The two women then viewed Sang-un's past life, 50 years prior, and learned from her past self that the only way to defeat them was for the Bulgasal to kill each other. Dan H-Wall and Yul-Ti arrived at the well, but Yul-Ti pressed Dan H-Wall to explain his reasons for killing his wife and children. Dan H-Wall refused, deeming it unnecessary to seek justification from a monster. Aware of the inevitable confrontation, Yul-Ti shut the door and cut the power. The darkness gave Yul-Ti the advantage, and he stabbed Dan H-Wall. Dan H-Wall attempted to speak, prompting Yul-Ti to lean closer. Dan H-Wall used the opportunity to punch Yul-Ti in the black hole, causing him to writhe in pain and flee. Yul-Ti, after running some distance, urged Dan H-Wall to stop, arguing that killing him would also result in Dan H-Wall's death, since Bulgasal aren't soulless monsters but share a single soul. Only the simultaneous deaths of both would be effective. Otherwise, both would remain immortal. Sang-un had long sought a way to kill Bulgasal, hence her curse on Dan H-Wall, designed to force him and Yul-Ti to kill each other. Dan H-Wall, however, remained resolute in his desire to end his suffering. Yul-Ti tried to dissuade him, revealing that 1,000 years ago, Dan H-Wall had begged him to transform him into a Bulgasal, leading to Yul-Ti's subsequent manipulation of Sang-un 400 years later to transform him into what he is now. Ignoring Yul-Ti's pleas, Dan H-Wall was ultimately pushed from the bridge by Yul-Ti. Si-ho tried to stop Sang-un from going after Yul-T, believing it would be better for both of them to disappear. However, Dan H-Wall had become more important to Sang-un. When she arrived at their meeting place, she found only Dan H-Wall's knife. A short while later, Dan H-Wall reappeared, having failed to kill Yul-T. Sang-un wanted to give up revenge, now prioritizing Dan H-Wall's safety. Together, they searched for Yul-T near the river but found no trace of him. Si-ho called to check on them and relayed the situation to the shaman and Dan. That night, Dan H-Wall and Sang-un slept in the same room again. The next morning, while making breakfast for Sang-un, Dan H-Wall wondered if she was developing feelings for him. Sang-un, unsure why she was drawn to him, retrieved the knife and offered to return Dan H-Wall's soul. She would rather die with Yul-T than see Dan H-Wall perish. He simply refused and put the knife away. Meanwhile, Si-ho confided in Du-yun about her ongoing unease regarding Dan H-Wall, although Du-yun seemed unconcerned. Dan H-Wall pondered Yul-T's words, questioning why the issues seemed to stem from 1,000 years ago, not just 600. As if remembering something crucial, he and Sang-un hurried back to Si-ho, asking her to look into Dan H-Wall's past lives. The shaman pulled Dan H-Wall aside, urging him to proceed with his original plan of transferring his role back to Sang-un. His inability to do so led the shaman to believe they had developed feelings for each other. She cared deeply for Dan H-Wall, her only family for centuries, but he couldn't find satisfactory answers. Dan H-Wall then joined Si-ho and Sang-un as they revisited the past. However, as they reached 50 years prior, the shaman's younger self appeared, warning them against going further back, as it would lead to everyone's death. Dan H-Wall and Sang-un returned to the old house, but on the way, Dan H-Wall had an idea. He decided to go to Yul-T's house, sneaking in while the guard was distracted. Behind a painting depicting various monsters, he discovered a long-held plan of Yul-T's. Dan H-Wall apprehended the guard, who revealed that Yul-T hadn't returned, suggesting he was still in the mountains. Leaving Sang-un in the car, Dan H-Wall searched the mountain alone, finding Yul-T lying near death under a tree. He demanded answers about the events of 1,000 years ago, intending to either imprison or kill Yul-T depending on his response. Yul-T, however, wanted Dan H-Wall to kill Sang-un first. Dan H-Wall's unwavering protection of Sang-un reminded Yul-T of his own unrequited love for her 1,000 years ago, which he believed led to her destruction. Resigned, Yul-T vowed to kill everyone Dan H-Wall cherished and urged him to act quickly. Simultaneously, one of Yul-T's henchmen, disguised as a police officer, attacked Sang-un, stabbing her. Dan H-Wall immediately rushed back, ignoring Yul-T's pleas. He found Sang-un sitting, only slightly injured. The blood was mostly the attacker's. The henchman returned to Yul-T, who drained his blood to regain strength. Back at the house, while stitching Sang-un's wound, Dan H-Wall acknowledged her almost feral defense, remarking that such a loss of control might be a good thing. After Sang-un was treated and discharged, Si-ho called again. Knowing about their sister's poor health, the family started to worry and demanded to go home. However, Ho-Yol wouldn't let anyone leave. The shaman, still feeling frustrated, led the group to pack their belongings. Meanwhile, Sang-un regained consciousness and changed her clothes. Unable to wash her hair, Dan H-Wall helped her. They both decided not to believe anything Yul-T said, as it only added to the confusion. After Dan H-Wall left, Sang-un noticed her wound resembled her sister's scar. Suddenly, memories from her previous life 600 years ago flooded back, revealing events from millennia past. She realized that Dan H-Wall was the first Bulgasal, the one who cursed her and made her the second. When Dan H-Wall returned, terrified, she stabbed him with scissors. She described seeing Dan H-Wall amidst a pile of corpses, smiling terrifyingly. She stabbed him in the right hand, causing the scar. However, this contradicted Dan H-Wall's childhood dream where he saw Sang-un among the corpses. The family returned, causing Dan H-Wall to explode in anger at their reckless endangerment. He lashed out at the shaman, who stormed off, packing her bags. The two young people had to placate her, as her departure meant starvation for everyone. Dan H-Wall spoke privately with Ho-Yol, explaining his anger stemmed from Yul-T's previous need for him, which had spared them. Now, with Yul-T's indifference, he intended to kill them all. Hoyol decided to find Yul-T's location, unable to wait passively and keep the sisters confined. Yul-T, meanwhile, sought out a former monster henchman with a penchant for killing and burying bodies. He gave this man a final task, as he was about to drag someone else to hell. Dan Hwal and Sang-un were forced to devise a new plan to send Yul-T to his doom. That night, while Dan Hwal tended Sang-un's wounds, she unlocked more memories of a past life where she and Dan Hwal lived happily together. She emphasized that the child wasn't related to them, dispelling any misunderstanding. Dan Hwal, worried she was becoming too attached to human life and losing her feelings for him, grew apprehensive. She startled and tried to leave, but he held her back, and more memories surfaced. These memories showed that after she stabbed Dan Hwal, he attempted to kill someone else. For some reason, Dan Hwal was killed, and Yul-T was present. This event caused a rift between them. Later, Hoyol called, revealing Yul-T hadn't been seen, but his name was involved. Dan Hwal didn't believe Yul-T would dare approach, so they continued their search. The next morning, Hoyol found a gardener in an orchard, the final location on his list. Suspecting foul play, he asked a police officer friend to investigate, but the officer was unable to help. Simultaneously, Du-Yun urged Dan Hwal to apologize to the shaman, who remained angry. Suddenly, the police arrived. The shaman stepped forward. They were looking for the suspect who killed past life monsters Dan Hwal and Sang-un. They escaped the house, waiting for the police to leave. Dan Hwal knew Yul-T did this to separate him and his allies. Even if he hid, the police would still arrest the others. Hoyol's subordinate was furious, but powerless to act. They were taken to a remote location, even the officer questioning this. The mayor, having lost Yul-T's support, turned against him and was killed. The wound inflicted by Dan Hwal on Yul-T's black hole continued to bleed. Dan Hwal called Hoyol and asked him to locate the police officer. He implied the officer was working for someone shady and had likely become corrupt. Suddenly, the gardener spoke, revealing their location to Hoyol. Dan Hwal rushed there, but Yul-T called, wanting to show Sang-un Dan Hwal's true nature and the reason she hated him in their past life. Yul-T locked all three of them in a shed and ordered the gardener to deal with them. Du-Yun pleaded with Yul-T, but he was heartless and walked away. While being beaten, the shaman prophesied that a demon who drinks its father's blood would rise from the abyss and reclaim its stolen soul. Hoyol arrived just as Yul-T, having drunk someone's blood, was leaving. The shaman, who had been bitten, urged them to run and leave her behind. She died shortly after. Hoyol entered to find the two young ones and could only comfort them. But peace was short-lived. The second demon arrived. Dan Hwal arrived later to find Hoyol injured, unable to protect the children. Both grieved the shaman's death. The events fully awakened the monster within Dan Hwal. The police officers who came to arrest him faced his wrath. He was about to attack the officer when Sang-un intervened. Now, ignoring his promise not to kill, he was ready to eliminate anyone in his path. Yul-T was right. He had shown Sang-un Dan Hwal's true colors. But Dan Hwal relented when he saw Sang-un's injuries. Si-ho and Du-Yun were taken by the monster. They knew they couldn't wait passively for death and planned to escape when the opportunity arose. Meanwhile, Dan Hwal frantically searched for information about the gardener. Hoyol remembered meeting him long ago and asked his police officer friend to check the records. The gardener had long been a suspect in a mountain climber's murder. He was Yul-T's accomplice, hidden to avoid arrest. Dan Hwal and Sang-un set off to rescue the children. A tractor blocked their path, forcing them to stop. The driver offered to help, creating a chance for the children to flee. However, Du-Yun's stab wound, aggravated by the earlier beating, slowed him down, and Si-ho had to help him. They hid in a greenhouse, where Si-ho held Du-Yun's hand and saw visions of their past lives. Just then, the monster arrived, and they split up to escape. Si-ho drew the monster's attention, knowing Du-Yun couldn't run fast. Her cries led the arriving Dan Hwal to them. He found only Du-Yun, who told him Si-ho had been taken, and that the monster was after Sang-un. The monster, more interested in Sang-un, confronted her, deflecting her knife attacks. As he moved to attack, Dan Hwal tackled him, recognizing him as the man-eating monster from his past life. A moment's distraction allowed the monster to claw Dan Hwal's eye. Enraged, Dan H. Wall unleashed his Bulgasal instincts, making the monster's nose bleed before ultimately stabbing him to death. They called Hoyol to report the situation and asked him to handle the aftermath. Dan H. Wall and the others released the police officer. Dan H. Wall gave him his number and warned him not to mention the incident if he encountered Yul T again. He also investigated the officer's family, as 600 years ago, the officer had betrayed and killed Hoyol for being a monster. Overhearing this, Sang-un saw Dan H. Wall becoming like Yul T. Meanwhile, Yul T pondered the shaman's prophecy, as it was Dan H. Wall, 1,000 years ago, who had given him the whole, not Sang-un. Dan H. Wall had cursed him, saying that in his next life, Yul T would have to turn him into a Bulgasal, or the abyss would never disappear. Du-yun, safely home, wished it was all a dream, contrasting the morning's normalcy with the current pain. Si-ho, downstairs, realized they shouldn't have let the shaman come, as the police were only after them. She went to find Dan H. Wall, who feigned indifference to the shaman's death, claiming she had ordered his death in a past life. He explained that his existence as Bulgasal was a result of his own actions from 1,000 years ago, claiming Sang-un no longer bore responsibility. He urged her to leave with the others, as protecting them was becoming difficult, and ultimately dismissed them. Hoyol was also sent away by Dan H. Wall. At that moment, Hoyol received a call from his subordinate and met with Yul T. Yul T revealed that Hoyol's previous father was a reincarnated monster, explaining his cruel nature. He pointed out that the one who always killed monsters was none other than Dan H. Wall. Yul T tried to persuade Hoyol to abandon Dan H. Wall and join him, reminding him of Dan H. Wall's supposed abandonment of his sister, leading to her death. The next morning, as Dan H. Wall walked around the house, images of the shaman repeatedly flashed before him, caring for him in her old age, younger and confiding in him about a traumatic experience, stressed from her new job, and as a child relying on him for comfort. Overwhelmed, Dan H. Wall contemplated stabbing himself, but Sang-un returned. He confessed that he had never allowed her to live with him for fear of growing attached and forgetting his past suffering. He cursed Bulgasal for his inability to have a complete family, lamenting the deaths of his loved ones and his own immortality. Sang-un promised to help him end his torment. The following day, they moved to a new home. Dan H. Wall admitted he had asked Yul T to turn him into Bulgasal, yet Sang-un still chose to believe him. She, however, knew this through her recovered memories, so it didn't matter. Dan H. Wall then took Sang-un to the forest where he became Bulgasal to see it one last time, as he was determined to die with Yul T. They returned and tried calling Hoyol, but he didn't answer. While shopping, Du-yun wanted to frame a photo of them all together. Dan H. Wall realized everyone present was from his former village. He had once hated them, but now recognized them as victims of his curse. The next morning, Hoyol received a gun from his subordinate to deal with Yul T, as that was all the help he could offer. Dan H. Wall and Sang-un went back to the forest. Sang-un attempted suicide, prompting Dan H. Wall to offer to transfer Bulgasal to her. However, he couldn't let her die after searching for her for so long. Back home, Si-ho was furious that they were both vying to die, leaving the living to grieve. Hoyol arrived and informed them of Yul T's location at the well, awaiting Dan H. Wall. They shared a meal, with Si-ho deciding to take over the shaman's duties and entrusting her child to Sang-un. Du-yun would pursue Dan H. Wall's intended plans, urging them both to survive and return. They prepared for their departure. Si-ho pleaded with Hoyol to ensure everyone's safe return, which he promised. At the mountain, Dan H. Wall declared that after imprisoning Yul T, he would return Bulgasal to Sang-un so she could live a normal life. If she wished, they could meet again in the next life for her to return it. Sang-un warned Hoyol not to shoot Dan H. Wall in the heart, as it was his weak point. Upon entering, they finalized their plan, and Dan H. Wall went in alone. He apologized to Yul T, understanding his actions were due to their pact. He also apologized for failing to close the black hole. Yul T, however, refused to accept such a simple apology, and they fought. Yul T, being the complete form, overpowered Dan H. Wall and threw him into the well for eternal imprisonment. He intended to kill Sang-un in front of Dan H. Wall first. As Yul T searched for Sang-un, Hoyol shot him in the heart, rendering him unconscious. He contemplated killing Dan H. Wall for past grievances, but was stopped by Sang-un. He struggled to decide, allowing Yul-Ti to regain consciousness. Sang-un tried to inject him with a paralytic, but it was too late. Yul-Ti grabbed her, and Ho-Yol continued shooting to distract him. He was stabbed by Yul-Ti but held on long enough for Sang-un to escape. Yul-Ti then proceeded to the well and threw Dan H-Wall inside. Ho-Yol used his last bit of strength to try and intervene, but it was futile. Yul-Ti ignored him, pursuing Sang-un relentlessly. Ho-Yol shared his final words with Dan H-Wall, knowing that only he could save Sang-un now. He made a desperate decision, allowing Dan H-Wall to break the taboo and drink his blood. Dan H-Wall wept, but reluctantly drank, understanding it was the only way to resolve the situation. With that act, the prophecy was fulfilled. The monster, having consumed his father's blood, would rise from the abyss. The story flashed back 1,000 years. A couple helped their 2 children escape into a cave. A soldier pursued them, but a young Sang-un intervened, saving the children. Dan H-Wall, aware of this act of kindness, allowed Sang-un to return the children to the human world. 5 years later, the children, now older, lived with a shaman who adopted them. While playing, they were cornered by the monster that would later kidnap Du-Yun. Sang-un stepped in, threatening the creature until it retreated. Dan H-Wall realized Sang-un was growing attached to humans and feared she would leave him. She promised she wouldn't, as they were the only 2 Bulgasal. Yet, she broke her promise and went to live among humans. He waited for her, day after day, month after month, but she never returned. Another 10 years passed. The children were now Si-Ho and Du-Yun. One day, while playing, they witnessed Yul-Ti murdering his brother to usurp their father's position. He was about to silence them when Sang-un intervened, scaring him away. He lied to his father, claiming a Bulgasal had killed his brother, and led his father to the shaman's home. Sang-un, caught in the act of using her Bulgasal abilities, took the blame. Despite the pressure, she kept her promise to Si-Ho not to harm humans and endured the ensuing torture. Their home was burned to the ground. The shaman and her mother were punished for harboring a Bulgasal. This forced Dan H-Wall to intervene. Sang-un fainted, and when she awoke, she was surrounded by corpses. In her rage, she lunged at Dan H-Wall, stabbing him, creating the scar he still bears. He pleaded with her to return with him, but Ho-Yol, along with the 2 children, attacked Dan H-Wall with 3 swords. Dan H-Wall cursed them. Ho-Yol would lose an arm, Du-Yun would be forever blinded, and Si-Ho would never bear a living child. He vowed to kill them then and in every subsequent life. As long as he lived, the curse would endure. Unable to bear witness, Sang-un stabbed herself in the heart, choosing to die with Dan H-Wall. He cursed her, vowing to find her again. Just then, Yul-Ti arrived. He took Dan H-Wall away. As Du-Yun tried to follow, Ho-Yol fatally stabbed him, vowing to apologize to both children in their next lives, wanting to spare his son from further harm. It was then that Dan H-Wall stole Yul-Ti's soul, turning him into the next Bulgasal, cursing him with the dark hole. The birth of a new Bulgasal created a new link, allowing Sang-un to survive. A life force later transferred to Dan H-Wall. Now fully awakened, Dan H-Wall confronted Yul-Ti to settle the score. Sang-un injected Yul-Ti with poison and was thrown aside. She found Ho-Yol dead and Dan H-Wall gone. Dan H-Wall tracked Yul-Ti to the cave where he and Sang-un had once lived. Yul-Ti revealed that after Dan H-Wall's death, Sang-un had returned to the cave, waiting to kill him. He offered Dan H-Wall his blood, promising to restore his full power and remove the dark hole, but Dan H-Wall refused. Sang-un arrived, stabbing Yul-Ti in the back. He retaliated, attacking both of them. Regretting allowing them to reunite, he stabbed Sang-un. Enraged, Dan H-Wall bit Yul-Ti's neck, reclaiming his power. He drained Yul-Ti until he was helpless, allowing Sang-un to deliver the final blow. Knowing he could not return from the darkness he had embraced, Dan H-Wall walked out to see the sun one last time. He plunged the knife into his own heart, ending the 1,000-year-old ill-fated connection. Even in death, Sang-un wanted to save Dan H-Wall by exchanging souls, but he forced himself to let it end this way. As long as he lived, the curse would continue to plague Si-Ho, Ho-Yol, and Du-Yun. Sang-un pleaded that in their next lives, he would search for her, and she for him. Even if a Bulgasal had no afterlife, he would demand it from the king of the underworld. She watched, heartbroken as Dan H. Wall vanished before her eyes. That night, she called her 2 younger siblings to pick her up, but her wounds overcame her on the way. She entrusted Si-ho with retrieving a family photo from Ho-yeol's place, urging her to honor their memory by having a child and building a happy family. Many days later, Do-yeon and Si-ho resolved to live well, waiting for Dan H. Wall and Sang-eun's reincarnation. 8 months passed, and Si-ho gave birth. Do-yeon returned to his studies. 5 years later, Si-ho's child had grown considerably. Another decade passed, and Do-yeon was making plans for marriage. 30 years on, the extended family gathered together, joyful and united. Si-ho remained in the house Dan H. Wall left behind, continuing to wait. Decades later, they finally found Sang-eun. They sent her a picture of Dan H. Wall's old house. Tears welled up as she made her way to the now overgrown building. As she explored inside, she encountered Dan H. Wall. He decided to buy back the house. As Sang-eun left, she stumbled and Dan H. Wall caught her, inadvertently injuring her. She went to retrieve a first aid kit, and upon her return, Dan H. Wall wondered aloud if they had met before. Meanwhile, the photo of their reunited family, taken years ago, remained perfectly preserved.